Only a century ago, there were barely 2 billion people on Earth. Today, we are a global family of more than 8 billion. For the first time in human history, our impact on the planet is so far-reaching that we have thrown nature off balance. Globally, we are exploiting resources to such an extent that ecosystems are unable to recover naturally. Waste ends up where it was never meant to be. What is at stake is the world as we know it. Floods, heat waves, droughts, crop failures, extreme weather events are now happening more and more often. Our way of living is unsustainable.
If we do nothing and do not change also the economic system, we will lose the living conditions as we have it right now. The future generations will not be able to have the same conditions as we have right now. We are ruining the planet and ruining the environment, so we need to change. So the planet will survive, the society not.
The world will still continue to exist, even when millions and billions of people live in poverty, when more people die of hunger, and when we have less species. Maybe humanity will be extinct, but in the end, some species and some ecosystems will continue.
The question is whether we can restore and conserve our natural environment in all its beauty. Can humans and nature flourish together? Can we safeguard the future for our children and for the offspring of all the creatures we share the earth with? The answer to these questions is a simple yes. Yes, it is possible. It's not too late. We can still make the world a sustainable home. What do we mean when we talk about sustainable development? To answer this question, it's worth taking a look into the past. Life on Earth first developed about 3.5 billion years ago. It wasn't until 300,000 years ago that our species, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa. About 10,000 years ago, in the first agricultural revolution, humans began to radically change the world by domesticating plant and animal species. To create more arable land, whole landscapes were deforested. About 300 years ago, Saxony's chief mining official, Hans Carl von Carlowitz, was faced with a timber shortage that was seriously disrupting the production of silver and the region's economy. More timber was being cut for the mines than could be regrown over the short term, further depleting the area's forests. Carlowitz wrote a treatise on forest management, calling for the planting of trees and the conservation of forests in order to achieve a sustainable balance between growth and extraction over the long term. His work is now regarded as the first explicit formulation of the concept of sustainability. Our understanding of sustainability has evolved over time. The Industrial Revolution brought another radical change in human life. It was a shift from an agrarian economy to one characterized by the large-scale production of goods, using machines and new sources of energy. Human impact on the environment increased immensely. At first, economic growth was thought to be the only goal of human development. But it didn't take long for the first signs to appear that the ever-increasing consumption of resources was harming the planet. Pesticides and monocultures were clearly damaging ecosystems and led to massive losses of biodiversity.
Books like Silent Spring of Rachel Carson were the first publications, the first contributions that showed that we somehow have limits of growth, but limits on Earth.
In the 1960s and 1970s, environmental disasters, such as the Santa Barbara oil spill, became the starting point for global environmental movements. The economists Herman Daly and Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen initiated a fundamental critique of mainstream growth economics and founded Ecological Economics. They called for an economy aligned with the laws of nature, because the economy is a part of the larger natural environment. and nature is more than a servant for economic activity. A river, for example, can tolerate a limited amount of industrial wastewater. But when that amount exceeds ecological limits, it affects the health of the ecosystem and ultimately destroys the natural resources that people and industry depend on.
Species should be able to live without being endangered by its own actions.
The Pacific island of Nauru, to take another example, was once known as Pleasant Island. Over a century of phosphate mining on a massive scale, combined with colonial and indigenous mismanagement, brought the island to the brink of collapse. Now its resources are depleted, the landscape is devastated, and its inhabitants live in harsh poverty.
So one approach to thinking about sustainable resource use is simply some top-down approach where you have physical caps on the amount of resources which can be extracted from the environment based on some notion of what a sustainable amount of resource extraction is. So this is exactly the kind of stuff that Herman Daly talked about in his work.
In 1972, the Apollo 17 lunar mission captured one of the most remarkable photos of all time. The Earth was seen as a blue marble suspended in the infinite reaches of space. Our planet was seen in its entirety, how beautiful it is and how utterly vulnerable. The Earth, like a spaceship, floating in the vastness of space, but carrying billions of lives. It too has a spaceship economy and must make do with the limited resources it carries. In this one image, the abstract notion of the Earth's carrying capacity became clear to everyone. There are limits to economic growth.
The way we define it in ecology is that a population of a species gets to a certain level beyond which it cannot be carried anymore by the environment. So it uses up too many resources and the population crashes.
The limits of the Earth's resources can now be seen on the calendar. Earth Overshoot Day is the day when humanity's demands on nature within a year exceed the amount of ecological resources Earth is able to regenerate that year. In 1970, the day fell on December 29th. In 2023, some 50 years later, the day fell on August 2nd. We are now exploiting the Earth's resources far beyond what it can produce in the long run. But this burden is much larger in the global north than in the global south. Earth Overshoot Day for the United States is in March. For Germany, it's in May. China's is in June. Indonesia and Jamaica exceed their resources in December. To meet the humanity's current demand for natural resources and to absorb the waste we produce, we would now need 1.8 Earth in the long term. But we have only one planet Earth. We are consuming the resources of future generations.
So in the industrial world, we here in Germany and in Europe, we have an overconsumption that needs to be reduced for sure.
The Club of Rome's Limits to Growth report, published in 1972, sold millions of copies worldwide with its scenario analysis of different possible futures. It predicted that the pursuit of economic growth, without regard to its environmental costs, would lead to societal collapse and a very sharp decline in living standards for future generations. Global collapse would result because of pollution, overpopulation, and a shortage of raw materials. This changed everything. Business as usual would lead to a collapse in global human welfare.
And a continually growing economy has to be, can only exist if the environment is continually growing, and it isn't. We have a fixed planet, a single planet with no new material resources coming into it. If the economy continues to grow, at some point it's bigger than the resource base on which it's dependent, and then it must collapse.
To chart a course towards a sustainable world, the United Nations Commission on Environment and Development commissioned the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, published in 1987. Its definition of sustainability proved influential for decades to come. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
It's talking about the needs of all humans in the current generation, and it's also aware of the fact that meeting the needs of the current generations is affecting future generations' ability to live well. So it has this intergenerational equity issue. And so when I think about sustainable development or sustainability, for me it's fundamentally a justice concern. It's about justice for current generations and future generations, but also for non-humans.
The Brundtland Report on sustainable development influenced a lot of people, including business people like Stefan Schmid-Heine, who published the very famous book Changing Course around the United Nations Rio conference in 1992.
More than 178 countries agreed on an action program for human development and environmental action in the 21st century, the United Nations Agenda 21. It was about thinking global and acting local. Sustainable development took on a deeper meaning in Agenda 21. Economic actors were seen as having a particular responsibility in achieving a sustainable world, as there is no economy without a society, and no society without the natural environment in which everything is embedded. Sustainability can only be achieved if human activities are balanced between these three spheres. Ecological concerns, so that our natural basis of life is safeguarded. Social concerns, so that equity, democracy, and peace prevail. And economic concerns, so that our basic needs for goods and services are satisfied. So, the bottom line is that a healthy ecology is the basis for healthy societies and sustainable economic activity. What exactly are the planet's ecological limits, and how do we know when we have reached one? In 2009, a framework was proposed that represents the main components of the Earth system being compromised by human activities. It consists of 9 planetary boundaries, capacity limits representing a safe space for humanity, and for all species sharing this planet to thrive and develop, now and for generations to come.
Planetary boundaries reflect carrying capacity of the world, but we now have 9 categories of planetary boundaries, like biodiversity loss, climate change, etc. And we now have even some measures that we see that we exceed some of the planetary boundaries. And therefore we can say a sustainable state, the desired future state, is, for instance, that we want to have an economy and society operating in the safe operating space of planetary boundaries.
Our Earth system needs to be resilient. Otherwise, we're basically running the risk that our life support system, which we all depend on, is essentially going to collapse sooner or later. So resilience at the level of the Earth system is vital, and that's where the idea of planetary boundaries came from.
As of today, 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries have already been exceeded. Climate change, biodiversity loss, freshwater availability, land use, nutrient pollution, and human-made pollution, such as microplastics and radioactive waste.
Many of the chemicals are not degradable in the environment. For example, additives like flame retardants and others from polymers, from plastics, and then they can accumulate in the environment, and they also can be taken up by us by food or inhalated by air.
All 9 planetary boundaries are interconnected. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus, for example, reduce biodiversity, which in turn affects the ecosystem and thus drives climate change. The introduction of new substances into the environment, such as pesticides, only exacerbates this vicious cycle. Humanity is causing abrupt, large-scale changes to the Earth's stability and resilience that may prove irreversible. Together, these limits represent a critical threshold for human life on Earth.
What is at stake is the life of many people, particularly marginalized communities or vulnerable communities with less resources, future generations, and those species that are endangered by current biodiversity crisis. So we are talking about 1 million of species that are expected to disappear in 2050.
It is not only crucial that humanity remains within planetary boundaries. We also need to reach at least minimum social thresholds. At present, no country can meet the basic needs of its population to live a healthy life in dignity with globally sustainable levels of resource use.
As Kate Raworth calls it, the challenge is to operate in this safe operating space of not having ecological overshoots and not having social shortfalls, and that is the vision of a sustainable state in the future. That is what sustainable development is about, to move from this state of unsustainability to this safe operating space of sustainability.
Sustainable development means human flourishing in an equitable and just world that is ecologically safe within planetary boundaries. In order to create global structures that enable sustainable development, in 2015, all member states of the United Nations adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The 17 SDGs, a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet, now and into the future. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are the global community's contract for the 21st century. The SDGs integrate social and economic goals with environmental goals. They recognize that they are interconnected with each other. The 2030 Agenda is a universal call to action to make the world more just, healthy, and peaceful. Its goals include no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being for all, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, and more. But, as is often the case with grand plans, implementation is proving very difficult. Progress on the SDGs has slowed and, in some cases, even reversed. The UN Sustainable Development Goals Report 2023 warns that the promises enshrined in the SDGs are at risk.
I struggle with them a bit because I think they are too complex and they are somehow not necessarily well integrated. So, for instance, SDG 8, which is about economic growth, is potentially in conflict with some of the other goals regarding environmental well-being. We cannot have an infinitely growing economy on a finite planet.
You need to ask, what do you want to grow? Yeah? What matters actually? And then you want to grow friendship, you want to grow beauty, you want to grow culture.
I'd like to use the Stockholm Resilience Center wedding cake for the Sustainable Development Goals, which you can see here. And in this image, you see that there's the biophysical basis of our life on Earth, which includes the biosphere, all the biophysical interactions in that biosphere. And then on top of that, we have a sort of a smaller piece of the wedding cake, and that's our society. And on top of that, we have the economy. And so far, the way we treat the biosphere is that we kind of ignore that it's a bigger slice of the cake than the economy and the society. So we're constantly focused on the economy. We're also maybe a bit less so focused on society and even less so focused on the environment.
So the ultimate means of human well-being is natural capital. And if we want to maintain human well-being, we need to maintain natural capital, because in the absence of that natural capital, it doesn't matter how clever you are, how many factories you have, it doesn't matter how much money you've got, you can't produce goods and services. You can't eat money. We need to think about what the goals of the system are. Not what the outcomes are, but what is it we really want to do. So I think there needs to be a sustainable development goal which is about what it means to lead a good life, to kind of re-envisioning what it means to live well.
Imagine a world where the dominant societal paradigm is no longer material growth or economic growth, but instead it's something like a healthier world, a just world, or a world where we can all coexist with the same level of wealth all around the world.
And then what structures need to be put in place in order for that to happen. And these aren't trivial questions, right?
Multiple perspectives need to be integrated to find effective solutions. This is what our sustainability programs at Leuphana are all about. We educate future change agents. We provide them with the knowledge and the tools they will need to help shape a sustainable future for the world.